Shall we get started, ladies and gentlemen? For those of you who do not yet have seats, they are bringing more seats in, and they're going to be coming up the sides. So please take a moment to find a seat. Welcome. It's great to see so many people out for this event. I'm Tom Merrill. I'm a assistant professor at the Department of Government in the School of Public Affairs here at American University. And on behalf of the Political Theory Institute and its director, Alan Levine, who is here somewhere in the back, Alan is really responsible for most of what we do with PTI. So I just want to take a moment to recognize him. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Janus Forum on the topic Gender Roles, Nature or Nurture, question mark. Question mark, I guess, is the important part. I have some comment while we introduce our speakers, but before that, I'd like to introduce Kevin Ralph, who is a master's student in philosophy and the representative of the Janus Forum, which is the student organization that's putting this on. So please join me in welcoming Kevin Ralph.
Thank you. It's really good to see a great crowd out here. I hope you guys are looking forward to tonight's event. So a little bit more about the Janus Forum. The Janus Forum is the student-led wing of the Political Theory Institute within the School of Public Affairs. Just as the god Janus works both ways, we host intellectuals on both sides of any given topic and hold student-led discussions to encourage thoughtful and fruitful dialogue on theoretically and politically charged issues. These events, including debates on topics in the past such as the place of the United States in foreign leadership, and in the future we're looking to host debates on the NSA and privacy, and also on the place of art within a state. And we also hold student-led discussions. In the past we've held one on conservatism and progressivism in America. And these events are the results of complete student choice, where the students are the ones who choose the topics and the speakers. And tonight is a result of such a discussion. For more information, please find us on Facebook, sign up for our email list, which I'll be sending around soon, or send us an email at aujanusforum@gmail.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin. Can you hear me in the back of the room? Yes? Well, I'll say all the interesting things when you can't hear me. How about that? Kevin neglected to mention that there is another Janus Forum event in the first week of November, which will be a debate about economic inequality in America, and the two speakers will be Charles Murray of the American Enterprise Institute and Tim Noah, I think most recently of the New Republic. So please join us for that in the first week of November. Before I begin introducing our topic and our speakers, I'd like to mention some classes on the topic of nature and politics that we're going to be offering this spring. If you're interested in the topic tonight, you might be interested in taking these classes. Robert Garrow, who is our postdoc with the Political Theory Institute, is offering a class entitled Freedom in the Human Condition. Professor Levine is offering a class on recovering human nature, and I am offering a class on bioethics and politics. So if you're at all interested in any of those topics and you want to continue the conversation, please take the classes. Our topic tonight, gender roles and whether they are based on biological nature or are purely a matter of social convention, is still a freighted topic. It's been a freighted topic for a long time. It seems to me that nature is always a problem in political life, but perhaps especially a problem for us today, and especially with regard to this topic. For a long time, feminists have said that appeals to nature tend to be oppressive, that they're very often a means of preserving an unjust social order and thwarting the flourishing of women. My own mother, who was told when she started medical school in the 1970s that she would really be better off and happier staying at home, raising a family, and being a housewife. From this point of view, from the point of view that's appeals to nature or a form of social oppression, what people call nature is really nothing more than a story that people tell for certain political reasons. Maybe it's even all social construction all the way down. But that's not the final word on the subject. Sometimes nature seems like a liberation from convention. And here I would ask you to consider the change in the way that gays and one cause of that change is that a lot of Americans were persuaded that being homosexual is a matter of who you were born as or part of your nature, as opposed to being something that you choose. To quote Lady Gaga, "I was born this way." As a culture, it seems to me that we think both of these things at the same time. For that reason, we're a little bit incoherent on what we think about nature. But which is it? Is nature really a cover for a certain kind of social oppression, or is it something that we ought to treat with respect, maybe deference, maybe not as an absolute authority, but at least as something we ought to take seriously? Tonight we have two speakers who are going to help us think about this question. Camille Paglia is the University Professor of Humanities and Media Studies at the University of Arts in Philadelphia. She's the author of many books and articles, including the controversial Sexual Personae, Art and Decadence from Nefertiti to Emily Dickinson. Her most recent book, which is now out in paperback, just out in paperback, is Glittering Images, A Journey Through Art to Star Wars. Paglia is also a well-known cultural critic and has written for many popular outlets, including Salon.com and Time Magazine. Jane Flax is a scholar in residence in the Department of Philosophy and Religion here at American University. After having been a professor of political theory at Howard University, political theorists have been together, so glad that she's here tonight, for many years. She's also the author of many books and articles, including Thinking Fragments, Psychoanalysis, Feminism, and Postmodernity in the Contemporary West. And her most recent book is entitled Resonances of Slavery in Race, Gender Relations, Shadow at the Heart of American Politics. And if that's not enough, she's also a practicing psychoanalyst here in Washington, D.C. So here's how this will work. Each of our speakers is going to speak for about 20 minutes. Professor Paglia is going to go first, and Professor Flax is going to follow her. We're then going to have a time for a brief exchange between our speakers in case either one of them said something that was controversial to the other one. We'll see how that works out. But then, the real point of this entire event is to open it up to questions from the floor. And I just want to remind you that Political Theory Institute, that we have a common conversation, not a common political agenda, that we're a community of conversation. We're here in order to agree and, more importantly, to disagree with each other. So I encourage you to come to the microphone and ask questions. Probably didn't need that encouragement. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to both Professor Paglia and Professor Flax.
Let me just test the mic. Is this okay? I have kind of Joan Rivers quality that can become abrasive, so this is pleasant? Okay. All right. Okay. Nature or nurture? The question informs many pressing issues of our time, from the origins of criminality to the legitimacy of intelligence tests to definitions of gender. The quarrel over nature and nurture can be traced to Romanticism in the late 18th century, when Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his follower, the poet William Wordsworth, defined nature as good and society as bad, the source of oppressive fictions that cloud our thought and distort our behavior. Rousseau is ultimately responsible for the approach still current among postmodernists and post-structuralists today, who believe that we are born blank slates and that prejudices, including normative gender assumptions, are inscribed upon us by social pressures conveyed through arbitrary and slippery verbal constructs. My own thinking on this issue of innate versus learned traits is heavily indebted to Romanticism. But I take the late Romantic view associated with mid to late 19th century decadents like Charles Baudelaire and Oscar Wilde, who saw nature as a beautiful but tyrannically mechanical force that we are obligated to resist and defy through ever-evolving permutations of culture. The precursor in this strain of perverse romanticism was not Rousseau, but the Marquis de Sade, whose voluminous writings had vast influence, including on Nietzsche, whom Michel Foucault, the deity of post-structuralism, claimed as his model. I have argued, as in my first book, Sexual Personae, which was an expansion of my doctoral dissertation, that the historical and mythological identification of woman with nature is true, based on biological facts that we may find unpalatable in these emancipated times, but that cannot be wished away or amended as of yet by science. But arriving at that highly controversial position was the result of a long process of observation, investigation, and reflection. Indeed, during my adolescence in upstate New York, I had angrily held a completely opposite point of view, which I was eventually forced to relinquish after the extensive research I did into both biology and anthropology for my dissertation. I had been raised as a baby boomer during the stiflingly conformist 1950s, when gender roles were rigidly polarized. Men were men and women were women, with a draconian dress code and rules of conduct for each gender. Much later, I became more sympathetic to the longing for a comforting stability on the part of our parents' generation, who had endured the traumatic stresses and sacrifices of the Depression and World War II. But the options for girls in the 1950s were very limited. They were expected to date and become wives and mothers, and there were few suitable careers for women aside from that of secretary, public school teacher, or Roman Catholic nun. The atmosphere was claustrophobic for any girl with ambition or a spirit of competition, which was viewed as grossly unfeminine. A biological paradigm certainly shaped those attitudes. For example, girls were constantly given dolls, on the assumption that girls needed and welcomed exercise of their innate nurturing instincts. I myself regarded this shower of dolls as a plague or infestation. I wanted swords and spears and knights in armor, and I telegraphed my rebellion by a series of transgender Halloween costumes that were highly eccentric for children in the 1950s. Biological assumptions were enforced at school. Girls were discouraged from taking drum lessons in music class on the presumption that they did not have the strength to wield sticks or carry a snare drum across the football field. Thus, I was stuck with the clarinet, which I played very badly for 8 years in the school band until graduation. In gym class, girls were thought to be too fragile for extreme exercise. Hence, we were not allowed to play full court basketball, but had to stop with great difficulty at the center line and pass off the ball to another player on the other side. So if, as a guard, I stole the ball at one end of the court, I couldn't bomb down to the other end to make a basket. These paternalistic protections were infuriating. Biological doctrine was explicit in an incident at my elementary school, when we 5th grade girls got in a rumble with the 6th grade girls at recess, from which I emerged in defeat and chipped tooth. In grounding me for 2 weeks, my classroom teacher sternly reprimanded me for having punched another girl in the stomach, a grave and dangerous offense because, I was told, I could have damaged her delicate reproductive organs, a claim which over time came to seem somewhat medically questionable. Rescue from this gender hell came through research, my mantra. In 1961, just before entering high school, I saw an article about Amelia Earhart in a local newspaper, which propelled me into an obsessive 3-year project delving into her life and times. Exploring the old volumes of decaying newspapers and magazines in the sooty basement of the Syracuse Public Library, I discovered an entirely different era, the 1920s and 30s, when first-wave feminism had inspired an extraordinary series of women achievers in the public realm. Earhart herself, to Dorothy Parker, Dorothy Thompson, Lillian Hellman, Margaret Burke White, Claire Bruce, and Katharine Hepburn, whom I had already spotted on then-neglected old movies on late-night TV. It was a revelation. It seemed to prove that standards of gender are mutable and dependent on social conditions. Later, I would understand more about the larger forces at work in that period. Above all, a rebellion against authority that energized the impudent jazz age after the institutional failures that led to the catastrophe of the First World War. The adventurous careerism of those singular women was in many cases a calculated reversal of Victorian conventions, which had exalted prudery and propriety and sanctified motherhood. However, throughout the early to mid-1960s, I was simultaneously observing the complex process of puberty in myself and my friends, both male and female, and also the operations of pregnancy, childbirth, and infant care among my extended family and others. There seemed to me significant, troubling, and even intractable issues in human physiology over which we have little or no control. Hence, the relationship between nature and nurture was becoming increasingly problematic to me. My earlier dismissive attitude toward biology was proving untenable. By the time second-wave feminism began in 1967, with Betty Friedan's co-founding of the National Organization for Women, I found myself as a college student already out of sync with the views of most feminists. The situation worsened in graduate school, where at a feminist conference held at the Yale Law School, I had a disillusioning close encounter with the celebrity feminists Kate Millett and Rita Mae Brown. Any appeal to biology was denounced as reactionary heresy. Passions ran high. In 1973, as a young teacher in Vermont, I nearly came to blows with a table of early academic feminists in Albany when I casually alluded to a hormonal element in sex differences. They unanimously declared that I had been brainwashed and hoodwinked by generations of sexist male scientists. Hormones, in their view, played no role whatever in human life. It was not simply that they were questioning hormones' level of impact on personality and behavior. They were surreally denying the very existence of hormones. I felt as if I had fallen down a rabbit hole in Alice in Wonderland. Studies programs were rushed into existence in the 1970s, partly because of national pressure to add more women to faculties that were often embarrassingly all male. Administrators diverting funds to these new programs were less concerned with maintaining scholarly rigor than with solving a prickly public relations problem. Hence, women's studies was from the start flash frozen at that early stage of ideology, which might be described as militant social environmentalism. In my view, biology and endocrinology should have been built as required courses into the curriculum of every women's studies program in the country. Theorizing about gender must begin from that foundation, even if biology is eventually minimized or rejected altogether. Rather than encouraging scholarly inquiry and free thought, women's studies programs began in an a priori way from an already crystallized agenda. No deviation was permitted from the party line, which was that all gender differences are due to patriarchy with its monolithic enslavement and abuse of women by men. The arrival of more sophisticated approaches, such as post-structuralist French feminism in the 1970s and difference feminism in the early 80s, brought little change, because both skirted biological facts or omitted them altogether. Male academics, sensing which way the wind was blowing, were reluctant to challenge the new power structure and shrank back out of fear of being labeled sexist and retrograde. History will not be kind to their timidity and cowardice. There was a kind of contemptuous indifference in it. Let the women make their own sandbox and play in it. Thus, the women's studies and later gender studies curriculum grew autonomously, battening on itself and creating its own insular canon protected from challenge from outside voices and even from dissident feminists like myself. But the real-life consequences of this wholesale exclusion of biology from contemporary social thought continue to multiply. For example, second-wave feminism has habitually been guilty of a callous and to me counterproductive denigration of motherhood. The tone for this was set by Betty Friedan's best-selling 1963 expose, The Feminine Mystique, a somewhat sensationalistic and suspiciously unsourced portrait of the miserable lives of bored, affluent suburban housewives. Second-wave feminism glorified the career woman and dismissed the stay-at-home mom as a traitor to the cause. This eventually made Friedan herself uncomfortable, and she vainly tried to steer feminism back toward the concerns of mainstream women. She suffered an acrimonious split from Now, partly over what she dubbed the Lavender Menace, that is, radical young lesbians taking over the women's movement and alienating it, she believed, from the general population. What I conclude from my own research is that despite the transformation in gender roles at certain colorful moments in history, such as Shakespeare's London, when Puritan preachers inveighed against a fad for cross-dressing, there is eventually and predictably a return to a polarized norm. Furthermore, gender experimentation, while very intriguing to us today, has usually remained an exceptional practice that was not embraced by the majority in any given society. Finally, a volatility in gender roles is usually symptomatic of tensions and anxieties about larger issues. That is, sexual identity becomes a primary focus only when other forms of identification and affiliation, religious, national, tribal, familial, break down. Furthermore, while androgyny or transgender fluidity is currently regarded as progressive, such phenomena have at times helped trigger a severe counter-reaction that could last for centuries. For example, the permissiveness of imperial Rome, with its empty ritualistic religion, created an ethical vacuum, soon filled by a massive spiritual movement from the Eastern Mediterranean. Christianity, which 2 millennia later remains a powerful global presence. Elite Romans vacationing in Pompeii or Capri undoubtedly felt that the relaxed, hedonistic world would go on forever. The overflow of gender theory into real life can conceal developing problems. For example, what are the long-term consequences of the disruption of biologic patterns in our imposing on young women a male-centered career path that occupies women's optimal years of fertility with a prolonged sequence of undergraduate and postgraduate education? By the time our most accomplished young women are ready to marry, they may be in their 30s, when pregnancy carries more risks, and when their male peers suddenly have an abundant marital choice of fresher, more nubile girls in their 20s. The TV series Sex and the City, which was a huge surprise hit internationally, dramatized the quandary of young career women as an unsettling mix of comedy and tragedy. I consider it completely irresponsible that public schools offer sex education but no systematic guidance to adolescent girls who should be thinking about how they want to structure their future lives. Do they want children? And if so, when should that be scheduled, early or late, with the advantages and disadvantages of each option laid out? Because of the stubborn biologic burden of pregnancy and childbirth, these are issues that will always affect women more profoundly than men. Starting a family early has its price for an ambitious young woman, a career hiatus that may be difficult to overcome. On the other hand, the reward of being with one's children in their formative years, instead of farming out that fleeting and irreplaceable experience to daycare centers or nannies, has an inherent emotional and perhaps spiritual value that has been lamentably ignored by second-wave feminism. Right now in the U.S., young mothers are automatically regarded as déclassées. They are pitied for wasting their talents. This animus, shot through with social snobbery, must end. Colleges and universities that claim to support women's rights must adapt to a more humane recognition of biologic needs and values. The presence of mothers or married students in general in the classroom would be of enormous benefit in bringing campus discourse about gender back to reality. Campuses should provide and promote flexible programs of part-time study with long leaves of absence permitted for parents to complete their degrees over many years or even decades. Similarly, our present system of primary and secondary education should be stringently reviewed for its confinement of boys to a prison-like setting that curtails their energy and requires ideological renunciation of male traits. By the time young middle-class men emerge from college these days, they have been smoothed and ground down to obedient clones. The elite universities have become police states where an army of deans, sub-deans, and faculty committees monitor and sanction male undergraduate speech and behavior if it violates the establishment feminist code. The now routine surveillance of students' dating lives on American campuses would be unthinkable in Europe. Campus gender theorists can merrily wave their anti-male flag when every man within 10 miles has fled underground. In conclusion, I do believe that gender roles are malleable and dynamically shaped by culture. However, the frequency with which gender roles return to a polarized norm, as well as the startling similarity of gender roles in societies separated by vast distances of time and space, does suggest that there is something fundamentally constant in gender that is based in concrete facts. A modern democracy, based on concepts of individual liberties, has an obligation to protect all varieties of personal expression. But the majority of Earthlings do seem to find clear gender roles helpful compass points in the often conflicted formation of identity. Gender questioning has always been and will remain the prerogative of artists and shamans, gifted but alienated beings. Extravaganzas of gender experimentation sometimes precede cultural collapse, as they certainly did in Weimar Germany. Like late Rome, America too is an empire distracted by games and leisure pursuits. Now as then, there are forces aligning outside the borders, scattered fanatical hordes, where the cult of heroic masculinity still has tremendous force. I close with this question. Is a nation whose elite education is increasingly predicated on the neutralization of gender prepared to defend itself against that growing challenge? Thank you for your attention.
We have to have a brief technological interlude here. Turn on the projector.
Your tweet.
Okay. I apologize for using this technology. I am a kinesthetic and visual thinker, and I can't think without some form of writing and pictures. And since I don't have a blackboard, I have to use this very imperfect means. Okay, this, by the way, is the human genome, and I will talk about that a little bit more. But first, question I pose to you, is this apple belong in the category of nature or nurture? Okay, so give me a show of hands. How many people believe that this belongs to nature? How many people think it belongs to nature? Nature. Okay, how many people believe it belongs to nurture? Okay. This apple didn't exist prior to 1960. Not this particular apple, but this breed of apple. It was created in a crossbreeding program by the University of Minnesota. It even has a U.S. patent since expired, patent US 7197. It's also interesting because it is not self-pollinated. In other words, it doesn't grow from its own seeds. To grow, it would be cross-pollinated, it would no longer be the hybrid it is. So in order for this apple to exist in its appleness, requires the constant interceding of human action. Okay? Now, my point is about this, which I hope to develop throughout my talk, is that it doesn't make any sense to talk about nature and nurture as antinomies. And that this doesn't, I think, represent a lot of current people's thinking, not only feminist thinking, but certainly biologists thinking. What biologists seem to be mostly interested these days is what they call epigenesis. That is the interrelationship between various kinds of biological potential and the environment, and how environment potentiates or undermines various kinds of genetic potential. So I think, in fact, these very terms are indeed problematic and slippery. There's nothing that when we talk about nature, as if it were in some kind of antimony to culture, we're already on the wrong path. Okay, and I want to show how being on this wrong path plays out in a set of assumptions which seem self-evident but really are deeply problematic. Okay, so to start, this is the human genome. Okay, as we know, in the human genome, there are 46 total chromosomes. And the only difference between the sexes is the existence of the small y chromosome, which males have and not females. Okay? Smaller. What this means, okay, the human Y chromosome, by far the smallest of the 46 chromosomes, contains about 60 genes. The X chromosome carries about 800. There are about 25,000 genes in the total genome. What this means is that males and females share about 99.8% of their genes. Okay, this is since we were said feminists don't pay attention to biology. This is Biology 101. Okay, so you could say, aha, but that 0.2% of our genes, that must be it. All right? And there must be, somewhere in that 0.2, are the biological basis of something called sex difference. So the question is, what is that? Now, when we talk about sex differences, presumably we're talking about various kinds of traits or behaviors that we can see and in some kind of determinist way link back to some kind of biological phenomenon. Now, for those wonks and wonkettes in the audience, this is something called a differentiation. It turns out that it's extremely difficult to actually figure out what might be sex-linked traits. and especially traits that fall out neatly on gender lines. And there's a number of reasons for this. First of all, most of the research is done on adults who spent their whole life in gender differentiated societies. Number two, even when we do research on infants, the research, obviously enough, is not done by the infant, but is done by adults. And these adults carry with them all the kinds of implicit biases that are involved in gender relations. Now, this is also very important because one of the findings that does hold up is that human beings relate very differently to male and female infants. There have been numerous studies that are well-founded, well-replicated, with sample sizes and no apparent source of bias that do things like, for example, they dress babies in either stereotypically male clothes or female clothes or neutral clothes. Some of those babies in pink are actually male. Some of the babies in blue are actually female. And both males and females are in the neutral. What they find is that if somebody thinks a baby is a girl, they coo at them, they hold them more gently, they hold their gaze long, they speak to them. If it's a boy, they think it's a boy baby, they act more roughly, they tend not to hold their gaze, they bounce them around, and so on. Okay? So from birth, we interact with babies in different kinds of ways, and this affects research. One of the most famous examples of this is there was a University of Cambridge study which purported to discover, looking at infants, that girl infants look at people's faces longer, from which was extrapolated the idea that girls are innately more social than boys, from which was extrapolated the idea that boys, because they're more physical and less social related, need different kinds of classrooms, from which was extrapolated that boys would do better if they were in single-gender classrooms. Okay, now there are two at least problems with this set of assumptions. Number one, the person whose face the baby stared at knew the gender of the babies. So the question was, did she stare at the infants and acted differently with the girls and the boys? And so what you're picking up is the behavior of the researcher, not necessarily some innate gender difference between boys and girls. The second problem with this is the end point, which is boys will do better in classrooms designed for boys, turns out not to be true. There's a big meta-study that was just released and found out there's no advantage to boys being in boy-designed classrooms, either in terms of what they learn or their classroom behavior. Okay, so the main point here is that it's really not easy for us to figure out what a salient gender difference is. All right? Now, nonetheless, people go on trying to figure that out. And one way to try to sort through things that are reasonable and not, or research that we might want to rely on, is to do metadata analysis. Okay? And there are numerous people who sort of spent their lifetime doing metadata analysis. And one of the ways they do this is to find well-founded studies, good samples, no apparent bias, etc., and studies that can be replicated. Because many of the problems are, there's one study with an N of 30. It shows something, people say, usually it gets attention, it shows a profound gender difference. And then you can't ever replicate it. If you do the same study again, it can't be replicated, you find the opposite results. So people have been doing these metadata analyses where they try to figure out, by aggregating various studies, what those sex traits might be. Now, on your left is what a gender difference looks like if it's 2.6. Okay? And this tracks actually the height differences between males and females. On your right, the bell curve, is how males and females fall out on metadata from 124 commonly measured sex traits. Now, and you notice on the bell curve on the right, there is tremendous overlap. Okay? What this means is that in 96 of the commonly measured traits supposedly linked to gender, the values were 0.35 or less. What this means is that in such sex differences, the curves overlap 76% of the time. What this means is there's more variation within a gender than between them. What it also means is that you can't use any available data to predict where an individual will fall on the curve. Okay? So if you decide you need a raise and your boss is a woman, you decide, oh, she's a woman, she must be more empathetic. You construct a story of how your family's having a hard time, your kid needs extra resources, you've been working so hard, it really would be a nice thing to give you a raise. You go into your boss. Your boss turns out to be one of those 40% of women who are less empathetic than men. And you don't get the raise. Had you presented an argument based on value added, utility to the company, and so on, you might have had a better chance. So the moral of the story is that if you're a human functioning within our current society, it's not necessarily safe to go on the basis of stereotypes. You can't really predict, based on a person's gender, how any individual will fall in a number of traits which we commonly associate or call sex differences. Okay? Now, that was a journey through biology. Moving on to one of our most important organs, the human brain. And here's where, again, it makes it extremely difficult to distinguish between nature and nurture. One of the things that people discovered in the process of the kind of new functional MRIs and all the fancy things we could do in neurology is that the brain is incredibly plastic. To talk about hardwiring is really a misleading metaphor because unlike a circuit board, the human brain doesn't have a fixed number of circuits. Throughout our lives, we remake, reconnect, prune, and so on our circuits. As one person said, the brain is what we do. Everything we do, everything that's done to us, alters our brain. Everything you eat, whether you go for a run, whether somebody's mean to you, those all, in some way or another, alter your brain. And conversely, laying down a habit means it's extremely difficult to change a habit because you've got a neural pathway and there's a lot of inertial force and you have to rewire your brain to really adopt a new habit. Okay? And so the brain is an open system. And when you add to it the fact that, as is listed up here, one of the times in which our human brain is most active in connecting and pruning our synapses is in the first year. And when you add to that the fact that babies are differentially treated based on gender, it's really hard to know what is nature and what is nurture. It really becomes a question that itself is questionable. Why do we frame it in that kind of way? Okay? So, moving along. The conventional narrative runs this way. There's a biological imperative called reproduction. This imperative drives us to have sex. This imperative makes both certain differences essential, in the sense without them we wouldn't have reproduction, and it also makes the salience of these differences particularly important. From this, therefore, we get gender. Because what gender is ultimately marked on is how you are mapped on particular reproductive organs, if you have a penis or a vagina and a uterus. Now, reproduction is treated as a biological imperative, the biological imperative. Since biological equals natural, bodies are natural. We treat bodies as if they're fixed and ahistoric. And we treat nature as the antimony of culture. Therefore, we get statements like, no change in society will change nature. If nature is the antimony of culture, culture will never change nature. Or sex is the natural in man. If we think of sex in terms of reproduction, reproduction in terms of biological imperative, sex is the natural man. Okay, but even one of Paglia's heroes had problems with this idea. According to Freud, from the three essays on the theory of sexuality, from the point of view of psychoanalysis, exclusive sexual interest felt by men for women is also a problem that needs elucidating. It's not a self-evident fact based on an attraction that is ultimately of a chemical nature. Okay, so sex, what is the relationship of sex and reproduction? Does sex reflect the biological imperative of reproduction? And is sex the natural in man? Okay, now immediately I have problems here. Because there are lots of sex that has nothing to do with reproduction. Even leaving sex is an unproblematic concept. People who are too old or too young to reproduce engage in sex. A lot of sexual practices, oral sex, anal sex, masturbation, have nothing to do with reproduction. And it's entirely possible for people who have the same anatomies to engage in such sexual acts. We don't need sexual difference to have sex. We don't need different organs to have sex. So to assume that there is an innate relationship between reproduction and sex is simply contrary to common practice. Now, complicating it too is if we complicate the relationship between reproduction and sex, we also complicate the relationship between sex and what differences matter. Depending on your particular sexual preferences, what really may matter is the nature of your fetish, which isn't a person at all. Depending on your sexual preferences, the existence, whether there's someone who has a different anatomy than yours, is simply not relevant. Conversely, we know in many other kinds of practices that there are differences which have nothing to do with whether you have a penis or a vagina, and yet they're crucial differences in our social practices. For example, what color your skin is. That's a crucial difference. Has nothing to but it's a difference, and it's red on the body, but it's a difference which really has nothing to do with sex at all. Or if you're in the practice of being a professional basketball player, the difference that matters first and foremost might be height. Or having if you want to be a ballet dancer, you have to have a certain kind of body type and a certain kind of flexibility. So what in the vast range of our bodies counts as a difference depends in part upon the practice that you're engaged with and the relevance of that body for that particular practice. So let's complicate it again. What kind of sex do these particular sex organs matter? Clearly, heterosexual genital intercourse. If that is the norm, and that's what we underlying think is sex, then there are conventional sexual organs. That kind of difference does matter. But not all kinds of sex have to do with heterosexual genital intercourse. And it only makes, all these links only make sense if that is the implicit assumption. Because, of course, heterosexual genital intercourse very nicely loops back to reproduction. And reproduction naturalizes this entire loop. So, just to close up here, there's an unconventional narrative, which is that you require both gender and normative heterosexuality to produce sexual difference. There has to be practices that name certain sorts of organs as being sexual organs and as the bearer of difference and difference in terms of identity. And as I said, by looping this back, we make it seem as if gender is required as a natural part of reproduction, which only makes sense within a certain discourse. Now, two more things I want to say is also that the way, if you think about reproduction, even from a biological point of view, reproduction is not the moment of fertilization alone, or even gestation. To be obvious, people have to stay alive to reproduce. Reproduction concerns to have a reproductive advantage means that you have to have the conditions of life which enable reproduction to occur and to reoccur. Not only do people have to stay alive, but their children have to stay alive. So then we're in a different terrain. When we start to think about it that way, we're in the terrain of life. We're in the terrain of embodied beings who are not only reproducing beings, but are pleasure-seeking beings, and importantly, moral beings. Because clearly, if there's any biological imperative, it's that we all live. We can interfere with reproduction. We can disconnect sex from reproduction. We can do all kinds of things. What we can't do is avoid death. And both pleasure-seeking and moral, inconveniently for the gender story, are species-wide. They aren't specific to males and females. All males die, all females die. Women are pleasure-seeking, men are pleasure-seeking. And our embodiment makes us vulnerable
thank you to both presenters. I think it's a thought-provoking discussion. Here's how I'm inclined to proceed. Since we're officially having a debate, I'm not sure what debate means, but I think that means that they get, our speakers get a chance to respond to each other. I suspect that there are many of you, there are many people in the room who may want to ask questions of your own, and so I'd like to keep the exchange up here at the table to a minimum, and then open it up to the floor. So why don't we do this? Professor Paglia, is it possible that you have something to say? That may be a loaded question.
Well, number one, the very interesting metaphor of the apple. But the thing is, I would never deny that agriculture, the word agriculture, contains the meaning right there. Agriculture was a great advance in civilization. I certainly would never dream of alleging that farming with can you move back farming was the moment that human beings began to tame nature. It was an enormous moment going from the nomadic to the agrarian period. So and many ancient poets, Homer, and there are just so many examples in the history of literature of celebrations of farming as a wonderful meeting point between nature and culture. So I just want to say that. But aside from that, when you I say my quote from the first chapter of Sexual Persone, no change in society will change nature. I really wasn't talking about human nature there, but rather the enormity of the cosmos that's out there that is much larger than the issue of global warming. That is, I look at it in terms of geology and of the just stunning expanse, millions of years of time and so on. I mean, I think there's a certain. I've complained about the absence of any reference to nature in post-structuralism. I think of post-structuralism as a very narrow, provincial worldview because it lacks a sense of the sublime, which you can find in Hinduism. The sense of just this huge expanse that makes human beings and human history very small indeed. That's actually that I was more talking about. Now, and then in regard to, I should leave time for you to criticize me, but in regard to sex, I personally still believe, that nature is a fascist force that implanted these biological compulsions in human beings to drive them together. I believe that it's rooted in the nomadic phase when human beings are staggering around and tormented by famine and by their own mortality, fatigue, and the sex drive forces people together in order to procreate. However, nature is wise, because when in periods of overpopulation, nature allows homosexuality to flourish. And I do think that I interpret homosexuality as natural, as a natural response to situations of crowding in nations as in prisons and ships, etc. But the idea that the enormous variety of sexual practices disproves the biological purpose of our sex organs, I would question that. I would say rather that human beings, as civilization develops, begin to mix up the sex impulse with art. That sexual desire, sexual scripts, sexual scenarios, sexual compulsions are like little mini movies that each of us have in our brain. It's almost like agriculture, in the sexual field. So I think that the variety of ways that human beings have found to spill off their excess, sexual and desires seems to be perfectly normal. I left the Catholic Church years ago. I had no problem in blessing any kind of variety of sexual preference there is in the room, including the fetishists. so on. But fetishism is a symbolic mode. It seems to me that the fetishist is a kind of a performance artist. So we could go on like this, but again, I don't think again that the plurality of sexual choices in any way disproves the overall biological imperative that is behind procreation.
Before you respond, Professor Flax, if people want to start lining up at the microphone for questions, we'll open it up in just a second. But Professor Flax, I think you get a chance to.
I'm not sure really how to respond other than to say that I think that, once again, there's nothing natural about it. This is one of Freud's fundamental points. The infant is initially polymorphous. The whole body is the neurotic cell. It's only under enormous pressure, prohibition, and a constantly re-energized repression and pain that most of us end up a certain sort. And so I think that it was a great advance to begin to raise questions about what possible relationship does reproduction have to sex. I'm not doubting that there is a biological imperative to reproduce. But what follows from that seems to me highly questionable. Furthermore, I think it's an error to think about our entire embodiedness, our being as embodied beings, solely through the trope of the biological imperative to reproduce. I don't think that's a tenth of the story of our embodiment. And that if we really want to talk about embodiment, we also have to talk about the other qualities, which are our vulnerability, our mortality, our tiny place in a world that really could care less about us. Nature doesn't care whether we reproduce. Nature doesn't care whether our species survives. The cosmos doesn't care that our sun's going to burn out and that we're going to be left, there's going to be this dead bunch of matter walking around or floating around in space. Nobody cares. We have to make a home. That's our vulnerability. And we make a home in multiple ways. It requires all kinds of practices to create life and maintain life. And so to think about biology, embodiment, simply through the trope of some kind of biological imperative to reproduce seems to me really wrong and turns out to be a way of simply naturalizing the utter inescapability of certain anatomically determined. That's what I think.
Should we take a question from the microphone?
Question for Professor Paglia. So, if we take the implications of your speech, so we take the assumptions that there are most definitely natural differences, and most people fit into the bell curve, but there are no problem. There are most definitely outliers, and so should we not be pushing for cultural acceptance of the differences for those outliers, the people who don't fit into the norm?
Oh no, I believe passing sentence, but I said that in any democracy, it has to respect the principle of individual liberties, and that the free expression, if it's not scaring the horses in the public place, okay, the free expression of any modality of sexuality seems to me perfectly fine. But I also believe that we are in a decadent period of Western culture, right? And that this is what I argued in Sexual Personality, that that the proliferation of sexual styles and sexual experimentation is it's actually a constant feature of historical cycles that are about to collapse. So everyone who is congratulating themselves on our wonderful progressive, gender fluidity, okay, well, okay, we may be fiddling while Rome burns.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much for coming. I really enjoyed the first part of this event. I have a question that's has two parts, one directed at each of you. It has to do with a kind of difficult subject of the prevalence of sexual assault in both historically and in today's culture. So, Professor Paglia, if we're to accept that this sort of gender imbalance of sexual drive or this sort of male prevalence for assault is natural, should we do anything to correct it, or is it just sort of a thing that we have to live with as a result of natural gender roles?
Well,
wait, can I just do the second half? Sorry. I'm really sorry. And for Professor Flax, if it's all due to, if nurture plays a much larger part, I guess why do we see certain sexual and gender-related behavior come up so consistently through history and through society, such as sexual assault, which seems to come up everywhere?
Well, let me just say my writings on the issue of date rape are the most controversial things I've ever done, and the argument over that just goes on and on. But the very first sentence of the very first essay I ever wrote says, rape is an outrage that cannot be tolerated in civilized society. And throughout history, honorable men have rejected rape, and most of the men in history, in my opinion, have been honorable men. There are criminals, there are exceptionals, there are deviants. Feminism has too often portrayed the rapist as somehow the model of the masculine. No one has a right to put a hands on you. Okay? What I have questioned in my writing is the blurred area of dating and of nonverbal forms of communication, and indeed of deep-seated ambivalence and mixed motivation on the part of both the partners in any sexual encounter. And the source of my own position on this comes from the fact that when I arrived in college in 1964, the parietal rules were still in effect. The colleges believed they had the right to act in loco parentis, in place of the parent, so that we had sexually segregated dorms, but the men could stay out all night. The women had to sign in at 11 o'clock at night. It was my generation of women who broke that, who rebelled. The colleges said to us, the world is a dangerous place. You could be raped. And my generation said, give us the freedom to risk rape. And that is the position I have taken, which is that the liberated woman should model herself on gay men who throughout history have seen the attraction of dangerous, anonymous sex in the shadowy corners of Rome or Antioch or wherever, okay, and so on, okay. And I don't want women, okay, to have gotten themselves into this infantile position which they now are in on the elite colleges, campuses, and all of their imitators, where something goes wrong on a date, and suddenly you're crying to authority figures, help me, and sort this out. Well, I think this is not feminism. Okay, this is going way backward, so again, there is sexual assault of any kind is criminal, and where is organized feminism in the United States on the issue of those mass rapes that are occurring in India? Absolute atrocity. I expected, to hear very loud feminist voices coming to the aid in some way of women in India on this issue. Instead, an absolute silence that seems to me shocking. Okay? That is the kind of thing that should horrify everyone. I think these are crimes against humanity. There should be much more of a global response, a boycotting of India. I don't know what. Okay, in order to stop this. I mean, clearly the problem is coming from an interface, okay, between women who are rising in economic and career power in India and a lot of men who are left behind. So these are clearly revenge assaults. Okay, there's sexual symbolism in these assaults, one of which ended in a death. So I do not want to ever mix up, as so many feminists have done, dating problems on elite college campuses with that kind of atrocity that's going on in India.
I'm not inclined to universal causes. So it's very hard for me to answer a question like, why has there always been violence of the sort of rape? I just find that unanswerable. But I do think that, well, first of all, the obvious, men get raped too, and not infrequently. And that I think that you have to look at the cultural practices around power, ways to exert dominance, and so that you would have to look at different cultures and how those kinds of things play out. And certainly if you believe that somebody is your property or is the property of your group, then it's easier to do various kinds of violence towards them. Or if you regard them as other, that in some way is fundamentally different than you, then it's easier to do violence to you. Or, and I also have to point out that when I don't agree that women have done nothing or feminists have done nothing about these matters, that there's a vast feminist presence in human rights organizations, that it was feminists who got ideas like sexual harassment and marital rape written into law as enforceable harms. I would hardly say that feminists have been absent over any of these mass crimes, including Bosnia and a whole long depressing list in which NGOs and international organizations of the feminist persuasion have been active parties. And so what I don't recognize is the way feminism is portrayed by Professor Paglia. I just have a completely different history with feminism, and I honestly don't recognize her view of feminism. I mean, to think her view of feminism is as some weird combination of extreme liberalism, people who think that the solution to patriarchy is to abolish civilization, and acolytes at the throne of Judith Butler and Michel Foucault. Now, I would really love to meet such a woman, or male, because how you could hold those contradictory positions together simultaneously, I would really like to talk to somebody. But I have never met a feminist, and I'm pretty well read in feminist literature. I've never encountered a feminist of the sort that she routinely portrays. And so as someone who since, the early 70s has been involved in various kinds of feminist movements, it does trouble me that these kind of, vast stereotypes and misrepresentations of history. Of course, some people say stupid things, but I don't think she's being fair to the history of either first, second, or third wave feminism. And so I disagree profoundly
Could I
with
just
her
could I,
answer to your question.
could I just say that I describe myself as an equal opportunity feminist, and I am proud of the role I played in helping third wave feminism get established. I was one of the strongest voices for pro-sex feminism of the early 1990s. So I'm sorry if I sometimes say feminism, without making it clear what I'm talking about. But I've had personal experience of my work being rejected from Ms. Magazine, of the members of the New Haven Women's Liberation rock band practically getting in a fist fight with me because of my endorsement of the Rolling Stones. I mean, it just on and on and on. It would be very difficult, it seems to me. You'd have to be a saint, which I am not, to have tolerated the kind of closed-mindedness that I have encountered on every round, including issues of art, okay, issues of art, and of the depiction of the human body in art. I mean, I would think you would be sympathetic toward that element. I would think you would be sympathetic toward the full sensual portrayal of the body in art. But for a very long time, there was a huge incident in the early 90s of a literature teacher, a woman feminist at Penn State, who complained about the presence of a reproduction of Goya's Naked Maha in her classroom, to which she had been assigned in the art room. She demanded its removal. Okay? So I mean, it's not as if feminism's hands have been clean on this question. I'm very happy, okay, with the tremendous success of the Madonna-inspired movement of pro-sex feminism in the 1990s. So that is the one where I feel quite at home.
I don't want to get in the middle of this. I do want to hear another question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both very much. Thank you. What would you say, Professor Flax, to the young women in the audience that as they get maybe 4 decades in the 50s and 60s, what is their potential single biggest source of regret, naturally their source of regret in life? Would it be that cultural forces conspired against them during their best years, perhaps in the form of the glass ceiling, or is it that nature passed them by in the form of mother?
It's hard to answer in general terms. I think that many people don't, first of all, many people don't want to have babies.
Most women feel that way?
No, I'm not saying that. I don't feel comfortable saying most women. I think that I talk a lot in my therapy practice about what people regret. And in general, what people tend to regret is that they sold themselves short and they didn't try something. That's what they regret. That they inhibited themselves in some way and they didn't go for it. But what they regret going for is radically different. It isn't. Some people regret having children. Some people, there's a vast heterogeneity of what people regret. And I don't think that the single thing that people would regret, all women, or all men for that matter, because not all men end up with children either.
With respect, ma'am, my question is, what's a bigger chance of regret? Is it that motherhood passed women by, or is it that damn glass ceiling that kept them from being all they can be? What's a bigger potential source of regret at 60 years old?
I'm answering your question. I think what we regret is not going for what we want. And I think people want fundamentally different things, and you can't. One of the things I've learned in my long practice is one of my supervisors said, be prepared to be surprised. And we cannot assume in advance what any person will regret at age 60. That's what I think.
I'm not going to thank you because you didn't answer my question.
Okay, well, I'm going to say thank you to both of you for being here today. I certainly wrote down a lot of notes that hopefully I can make out later. My question is for Professor Paglia. During your presentation, you mentioned how you believe that In addition to having sex education in school, you also believe that younger women should be educated and help planning for when they're going to get pregnant in their future. And my question is that especially since sex education starts very young, I think for me it was like at age 14 in school, and at 14 I wanted to be an actress. How can we really expect women so young to be planning for their future and for when they want to get pregnant, especially as science is advancing and making it safer and easier to get pregnant later in life?
It's just a matter of, I think, of maximizing reflection on life choices. I think, want to have younger women and adolescents starting to think, how do you see your life at age 50 and 60? What rewards do you think you will have achieved at that point? It's asking a lot, but the problem is that in today's youth-oriented society, with these enormous cohorts of young people on constant social media, et cetera, there's a kind of blocking out of the elder generation, a lack of a witnessing of life cycles. Okay, I myself, so much of my work is based on my just observation of everyday life and listening to conversations and just everywhere on the street, or for example, visiting. I live in Philadelphia, and visiting the New Jersey shore, I've been very struck by working class beaches like Wildwoods, seeing the multiple generations of families there on the beach who've gone there for decades, and how touching it is to see the older people brought to the beach, sitting in their chairs as the waves are washing, barely able to move, and watching their grandchildren and great-grandchildren run. Okay, and I'm going, wow, this is something profound here. Okay, that when people reach that age, in their 80s, are so infirm, your career successes, whatever they were, fade. Nothing is left really of what you did in the career realm, and all that's left at that point is a sense of continuity of life itself and of the part that you played in it. Now, these are not the choices I made. I never had any desire to have a child. I was obsessively focused on writing. I've since have an adopted son who's now almost 11, so I've seen child rearing up close. But I think there's something wrong with the values of our society, which so worships at the altar of career success at the present moment. I think there's a kind of artificiality in it, a lack of wisdom. This is not actually the 1960s revolution that I witnessed happening in my college years, when so many my fellow students dropping out of college to not necessarily to marry, but to join a commune, to bake bread, to have a baby, and so on. There was a kind of defiance of the bourgeois career system. That's all gone now. You've lost status. You're not important any longer, unless you have these external markers of position and money. So I believe it is in the best interest of young people to have these issues brought to them in adolescence, to be thinking of what you want in your life, to start thinking in the long term. And then, if you want children, okay, when should you have them? Is it best for a woman to have children when she's young, and then to resume her career afterward, which may never be of the stratospheric heights it might have been if she'd rejected children to begin with? For example, my parents married at 20. My father came back from World War II and had me at 21. So I had very young parents, and I think that I got from them a certain energy level that is not possible from parents with settled careers in their 30s or 40s. So there's always every choice. There's a plus and a minus. I just believe that it is irresponsible to be teaching sex education without also talking to both sexes in terms of long-term options.
Thank you for clarifying.
Got lots of questions, so let's try to make it speed.
I also want to thank you both for the debate. debate. I think I was just commenting to my friend. It's been a long time since I've been at the university, and seeing these kind of debates and discussions. It's nice. People are actually matter. In fact, it's interesting. This gentleman obviously got very upset, but I mean, no, but I mean, this is a. I think that the conclusions we're drawing matter, right? So it's not like this has a neutral effect, particularly with experience and identity, and our experience with identity. So anyway, my question is more along those lines and related to perhaps experiences of gender. You had a number of very interesting facts, which I found intriguing. Paglia didn't have the same kind of thing going on, right? So I mean, she was much more seemingly speaking from experience. I'm curious, particularly about the apple example. Let's start there because I think it gives a good idea of what I'm trying to get at. We aren't apples, right? That seems to be the first conclusion I draw. As a matter of fact, apples don't ask these questions. We do. So it seems like with that example, the issue is that, and I feel like this may be the conclusion we're drawing, Professor Flax, wrong, that if we're simply just material that can be molded, shaped in any way, then why does it matter, right? I mean, ultimately, we can define ourselves how we want. In fact, technology's done a great job of allowing us to, perhaps, for example, separate pleasure from reproduction. Right? Contraception is very good at this. So my question, again, is to get back to experience. Do we experience gender in a factual way, to say something that isn't mutable, isn't changeable, isn't up to us, ultimately? So, for example, do I decide what gender I am? Or is it simply something that is socially constructed upon? What is, I mean, I'm interested in both of your experience with this, because it seems to me that gender exists, that it's a fact. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having the conversation at all, right? So it's there, we're talking about it specifically. So, yeah, I guess to bring it back more to outside of the philosophical realm, more of a concrete fact, I mean, does gender exist? Is it real, right? And if so, right, what is our actual experience with it? Why is it that there is male and female and we identify as these? I hope this is kind of...
Well, yes. I mean, if I could, I'll just answer from here, and then Professor Flax can answer. I myself certainly experience gender as something that happened to me. Yes, I would define myself as transgender. I did not identify in any way with the social role of girl or woman, and my writing is kind of the result of that swerve, away from this imposition I thought was an imposition by society. But when I experienced puberty, I realized that the forces of biology are far greater than anything in society. I completely rejected that experience. On the other hand, it's almost as like a Dr. Frankenstein experiment. My mind was already so clear. I think it's maybe one of the first times ever that such a clear mind has observed with enormous resistance the entire process of puberty. Okay? All right. So, yes, gender's there. Yes, it is. Okay, that's my answer. But now, Dr.
No, I mean, I'll even be more clear.
Okay, Professor Flax will have quite a...
Yeah, to make a very simple question. Is it true that gender is simply neutral and mutable, or is it something that we have to face, right? And that actually says something to us versus us to it?
Well, I think that there's a very interesting concept which is called a social fact. Okay? And gender is a social fact. It's something that none of us can be voluntary. You can't go, when I get my driver's license, I can't give DC a long argument about why the categories of male and female are not particularly relevant and what their history is, and so on. The poor lady just wants me to check a box. And so gender is a social fact. We are required to locate ourselves across certain grids. The way that fact is constructed draws on heterogeneous kinds of material, including making certain kinds of anatomical features socially relevant, including categorizing what are the ultimate experiences experiences of different people. There are all kinds of material that go into constructing that social fact. It's not, it's clearly a historical. Social facts are historical. It is not the case that gender roles are always and everywhere the same. In much of Africa, for example, women do all the hard physical labor. Men sit under the trees and...
But nonetheless, they have the children, excuse me. I mean, I still, this is, the point is that, sure, they can be socially constructed, but ultimately, aren't they the ones that determine how we respond? So, which is to say, if I'm a male, and I have a penis, I can't impregnate another male. No matter what I do, my sperm, right, another person's butt, okay, are not going to create a baby. However, if I do the same act, right, but with a woman, right, in the right orifice, okay, probably, right, and not if I'm lucky, actually just biologically speaking, right, no, I mean, it's in a sense we have to be this specific because otherwise no one seems to hear. I mean, probably in 9 months I'm going to have with a kid.
Okay, but what does
Right?
that have to do with gender? That is my point. What does that have to do
I think
with
that's why I
gender?
can't have this discussion. I think that's what's frightening to me is that we're not even capable of having a discussion right here because we're not capable of recognizing that gender is the one making the decisions here and not us. Yeah.
Professor Flax, you
Sexual
want to have one more
difference.
response and then
Yeah.
move
No,
on?
let's talk to somebody
Okay,
else.
okay. So, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both for your time. This was fascinating. Is the mic working? My question is to Professor Flax. I'm not positive I understood what you're saying as far as humans being, I'm not probably not using your correct terms, but outside of history, we change as history goes on, I think you were saying. What do you say to the sort of scientific evidence of evolutionary biology as far as, sorry, I can't think of a better example, but we were talking about this in my psych class, that people tend to be more afraid of snakes than electrical outlets, while so many people get harmed. We're more in danger of being hurt by an electrical outlet than a snake. But that would kind of go back to our evolutionary fear of snakes because they were a threat to us in the jungle. Wouldn't that allude to the fact that we are part of the history of biology and not moving it along and changing with it? Makes sense.
What I've been saying is that over time, it's wrong to think of the human body or the other features of our material world as fixed and unchangeable. That both other aspects of the material world and our bodies themselves change over time. That's what I was saying. Now, that was really the whole point.
Oh,
Okay?
more of a general.
Now how things, why it is that people are more afraid of snakes than electrical outlets. I don't think necessarily you can explain by evolutionary biology. What I would suggest is you look at somebody like Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about the various ways in which our brain operates, the way we calculate risk, the kinds of implicit assumptions, and so on. I think that would be just a kind of much safer and much more empirically based answer to that kind of question than speculating about how through some Lamarckian or collective unconscious inheritance we end up being afraid of snakes based on what our ancestors in the jungles did. So, as a kind of empirically trained person, I like to follow the principle of economy of information. And that's where I would start.
Do you have a response to that?
Well, I have all kinds of superstitions about the atavistic and primitivistic heritage of the I came out of the 1960s. What can I say? It's like spiders also. Okay, that the there's like a horror, okay? It's not just terror, it's also horror. And then there is a kind of symbolism in there that, who knows, okay, whether it's possible for us to have reactions that are in some way ingrained in our genetic heritage based on very remote experiences. But this would be rejected from an empirical point of view, obviously, and merely speaking symbolically.
Yeah, I guess snakes and owlets aren't the best example.
No,
That's
no,
all I
I mean-
could think of. Thank you very much.
So in interest of time, and I hate to do this for the people who have been waiting patiently.
Oh no.
Can I?
Oh, no, the
Let's take some more
audience wants to
questions.
hear the question.
Let's
Okay.
do it quickly.
This actually turned out to be an appropriate follow-up to the previous question. This is mostly for Professor Paglia. So you kind of continually reassert this predominance or power of nature over the totality of existence, and you kind of appeal to some new agey sounding
Yes.
symbolism
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Hinduism
Yep.
vaguely.
Yep.
So, and kind of dismiss the effect of or global warming on as
Yes.
an example of humans' capacity to affect nature on, in your perception, a micro level scale. So, I guess my question, in short, to you is kind of twofold. Like, one, what are the characteristics of this greater cosmos that you believe to govern the universe down to regulating specific gender roles or characteristics? And secondly, how do you account for the fact, even based on evolution, that the universe itself, everything included within it, is constantly changing?
Oh, I think my point of view is very close to the Native American view of the elemental powers of nature. In fact, that is my next project. I'm been for several years now been collecting material about this, the Native American view. I just have a sense of the grandeur of nature and its overwhelming force, how puny mankind is. I do believe in climate change. I believe that climate change is absolutely a permanent feature of the Earth. And part of it comes from having been raised in upstate New York, where the remnants of the glacier having gone through at the conclusion of the last ice age are so apparent everywhere, and carving out great canyons. Niagara Falls is a remnant, of the glacier's a pathway and so on. I just have this sense of the smallness of humankind. I think it's irreligious, okay, and I'm an atheist, right? Irreligious, okay, to imagine that society is as powerful, a force as our current theorists, want us to believe.
And I guess I just have one more brief question. You talked about, you kind of drew like a correlation between gender fluidity or sexual fluidity and societal collapses. How do you justify this beyond the point of like irrelevant correlationism? And also I'd like to open this up to Professor Flax as well. Like, what do you think of the role of certain characteristics of specific modes of production throughout history?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by that, but
Like feudalism,
Oh,
capitalism,
right. Well,
agrarianism, primitive communism,
my
etc.
first book, Sexual Persona, begins in prehistory and moves all the way down to, I got as far as Emily Dickinson. They cut off, the last volume of Popular Culture. It was already 700 pages. But I see my theory is unfashionable at the present moment. I do see history as cyclic. I see it as moving through phases that with an organic metaphor, rising to cultural energy, burst of it, rising to a peak, a classic period, and then a kind of long spiral after that that I call the decadent, a late phase in culture. I just see these patterns everywhere. I try to argue that. It took all those pages to do that in Sexual Persona. I just feel that the thing that interests me most, okay, which is this fluidity of gender. It's been an issue, for me. I began studying it in college and literature, and examples from real life. So I can simultaneously embrace it and applaud it, but at the same time, feel that that when these manifestations do happen, it's usually a symptom of old forms of affiliation and identification breaking down, and that there is a kind of anxiety in it, and that and I mean I see no reason to think that Western culture, as it's presently constructed, is going to be different. That's what the Romans thought, and the ruins of Rome are everywhere.
2 more questions.
Hi. I'd like to ask Professor Flax about her idea of her rejection of the idea that innate biological dispositions incline us towards certain expressions of sex and gender roles, in particular in relation to sexual orientation. And I'd like to use my own life as an example. I am a gay man. Growing up as a kid in the 90s and then hitting puberty in the early 2000s, there were no representations of homosexuality in the media. I didn't know what being gay was until I was in middle school. Yet, as a child, I fell in love with musicals, with pop divas, the characteristically gay aesthetic of theatricality, glamour, flamboyance. But why is this? I didn't even know I was gay at the time.
Well, I have 2 things to say about it. First of all, I think it's probably our sexual desires are on the same kind of level. There are probably people at either end who are very strongly attracted to people of their same gender, and there are probably a lot of people who are in various places along the curve. But I also want to say that the idea of articulating our identity via our sexual preferences is a modern thing. Prior to this in the 18th century, there were no homosexuals, which is not to say that men didn't have sex with men or women with women. But the category and the idea that that has anything to do with our intrinsic identity, intrinsic to truth, is a modern historical concept. We can watch where it emerges. That's a very important fact. Ancient Greece, men had various kinds of relationships with each other, but that didn't determine what their identity was. They identified as a citizen of Athens or a member of a kinship group, and so on. And so I think that both there's tremendous variation in how people fall out along the lines of sexual desire, and that the idea that who we're attracted to is a fundamental part of our identity, and that to answer the question, who are you have to state who you have desire to. That isn't historically inevitable. That isn't something that has always existed. And so on both of those grounds, that we have to look at it in a more complicated way.
May I say, I'm sorry, but Foucault was wrong about this. The invention of the polarized terms, heterosexuality and homosexuality, was a late 19th century phenomenon involving a medicalization of sexuality that was itself a kind of response to the emergence of the idea of sexual identity with romanticism, which is itself probably pathological. But the idea that there were no gay men in history by other names is simply wrong. They were recognized everywhere in Paris, during the early 19th century, in the times of the French court. The Italians were notorious, for this in the Renaissance. The Spanish priests, the idea that in classical, in ancient Athens, that it is true, that you had a relationship of a mentoring kind between older men and boys who marriage was late, age 30 in ancient Athens. However, there was great condemnation of a class of persons who had sex, passive anal sex, there were words for these categories in Greece, in Rome, and throughout the ancient world. So this is one of the areas where Foucault proved what a poor historian he was and how indifferent he was to research.
Let's have one more question.
So this is a question for Professor Paglia. I grew up in Colombia, and then I moved here. So I, kind of grew up in a very patriarchal household. Men will be men, and girls will be girls. And my dad would tell my sister, if you're gonna get married, you're gonna have a child, kind of stay away from your career first. Raise your child the first year, and then go into your career. And then, coming to university, that can be seen as, he's being ignorant. Female should do whatever she wants. But I realized because my mom, she takes care of little children, of like professional women, the babies at one point would actually become more attached to my mom than their own mothers. And I saw that inner struggle of a lot of professional women, that, they're lawyers, they're very successful, but they don't have that connection with their daughters, or their children. Their children are closer to my mom. So obviously, speaking as I'm actually really asking this question because it doesn't really affect me, but I think it's something really interesting. And you talk about career, how some people sacrifice their careers for their children, and they're seen as, ignorant or backwards, or vice versa. So just wanted, to get a little bit more about that.
Well, there's no doubt about my opinions about these things are coming from the fact that I'm the product of an Italian immigrant family. All four of my grandparents were born in Italy, from farming communities, and and my mother was born there as well. And the power of the mother and the relationship between mothers and children, and particularly sons, okay, in Italian culture, cannot be exaggerated. Now, obviously, the women of my family, most of them had no careers whatever, and gender roles were quite polarized. The men worked in the factory. They came to America to work in the Endicott Johnson shoe factory and so on. But that, it seems to me, looking, I think Germaine Greer has also commented on this, and she's traveled the world quite a bit, is that the pleasure taken in children is a universal. It's universal. It's everywhere. People in poverty can be very attached to children, and the lack of respect for that in our correctly ambitious era. We want women to achieve equality, and we want the story to come out well. We want women to be important. We want women to be leaders at the top, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems to me at least a hypothesis that's worth considering, whether there is something innate in not all women, but in the majority of women, something at the instinctual level that makes them makes them gravitate away from what could have been a stellar career toward just being with their children. And why does that need to be defended in Italian-American terms? There's no need to defend it at all. That is actually, a supreme sacrifice a woman makes for the continuation of life.
We'll let Jane have the last word.
I have to say I find this discussion very disturbing because it's not feminists that make it so hard to have children. Our society is profoundly anti-children. We have no care for our children. Despite all of our language, we have no decent health care, we have no decent supplies for our children. Our society is in no way organized for the well-being of our children. And this is not something that feminists have created. And one of the problems of looking at gender roles in this narrow way, we lose sight of a fundamental fact, is our entire society is required to raise children in a decent way. The way work is organized makes it impossible for men or women to care for children. Everybody suffers, and that is not something that was created by feminism. It's not going to be solved by having women stay at home and take care of their children. Children will still have the same lousy schools, the same terrible daycare, the same terrible medical care, the same terrible circumstances that the 40% of our children who are in poverty in this country face. and all the other children to varying degrees. So if we want to talk about a world in which it's possible to have children in a sane way, the answer is not that it's women's reproductive responsibility. If we only heeded biology, we would have wonderful children and a happy life. We live in a hateful, in my view, a hateful, life-opposing society. And until we fix that, we're going to have miserable children, miserable women, and miserable men. That's what I think.
Wait. I must. I must support Professor Flax's desire for us to have more rational daycare, for working mothers, especially of the working class. However, may I make the point that our society, if it's incoherent, it's because of the size of it and its transience, and also of the transition from the old extended family to the nuclear family, okay, which isolates middle-class families, middle-class mothers at home, often in the suburbs, without any support system near them that actually many working-class families still retain in decaying areas of the great cities. In smaller countries in Europe, the government-sponsored daycare is not such an intrusion into people's life. People expect it, people want it, and it's often extremely good. But families, even living in the capitals, are not that far from their communities from which they came. They're not that far from the grandparents and the other generations, and the aunts and uncles. In the United States, what is unstable about our culture is how disconnected it is, and how far we are from the old resources. For example, a woman living in an affluent middle-class suburb is unlikely, okay, if something has an emergency, to go to the neighbor and say, "Can you take care of my child for the afternoon?" Okay. Oddly enough, in the working-class environment that I remember clearly, and my Italian-American past, and that still exists, okay, in many sections of the cities. There's a stability in the housing patterns. People don't move, for the glam job someplace. You know the neighbors, you can trust the neighbors, and there's a kind of extended group, okay, that can pitch in for child care issues. And in larger families also, when there were larger families, the older children took over the child care of the younger children. There's so much evidence through history of younger children, speaking of the eldest daughter as having been a mother figure to them. So the breakdown of all these patterns, our terrible isolation, okay, in the anonymity, okay, of our the higher up you go in society, the more money in the United States, the less likely you are to have retained connections with the many generations of your family. You don't vacation with them, and the less likely you are to know your neighbors or to rely on them.
Thank you.
I have one announcement. When we finish up here, there are refreshments in the back, which are here for you to continue the conversation, which I suspect will continue. I'd just like to say, to echo something one of the speakers at the microphone said, these are hard things to talk about. They're things that touch us where we live. And the fact that we're having a conversation about it, I, for one, am at least very grateful to both of our speakers for taking the time to try to have this conversation. Please join me in giving them a round.